All right, so in the last couple of videos, we've gone over what a component is. If you're still kind of on the fence about what that is, here's a couple of good bullet points about what a component actually is. Um, and in the last video, we learned how to build a function that's going to programmatically create components for us. In that last video, we did something like this, where we said button1 equals, called that function, we passed it a string, so we're going to say button1, right? And then we went down here into our container, and then we appended that to the button1, right? And so then we got that button to append on the container, right? And we had some functionality to it. I might change that alert to a console log so that we're not getting constant alerts when we click that button. All right, go console, we'll through that. And then we'll see, we got that button that's clicked. Cool. So we've created one component here. We know that because we have this awesome function that will create components on the fly for us, we can say component 2 or button 2, create a brand new button just like that. Pen is not happy with me right there. All right. And then we can append that button as well, right? We can create these buttons. We could even, right? What is this returning to us? It's returning that button element. We could take button1 and say something like, we could extend the functionality. We can change the text color to green, right? So we could do that, right? That's a little advanced, but we could extend the functionality of that because we just get that element back. We just added that element to the screen. So a lot of times when we create these elements, when we create these components, what we want to do is we want to render them based on some data that we get. In the next lesson, either tomorrow or in a couple of days for PT folks, we're going to learn about how to ask a server for data. And so a lot of times, most of the time, when we get data back, we don't know what's in that data, right? We don't know what it is. We would expect it to be formed a certain way, and that should be a constant in how the data is formed. But let's say it has one item in it, or it has 100 items in it, and sometimes we want to build and display a component for each item in that data. It may be an array, most likely an array. And we want to do this dynamically, right? And so if we had some data, let's just come up here and we'll go const fake data. And I'm going to copy paste it straight from Training Kit. We have 4 buttons in here, right? Right now, how would we go about doing all these? What we would do is something like this, fake data 0. I'm going to just we have 4 buttons on there, and we want to go in and create 4 buttons, right? And then we would need to go up 3 and button 4, right? Cool. So now we're using that array. We're going over and getting each of those strings out of there and creating a new button based on that string, and we get it, right? Button 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we can even see on our console here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We have 4 separate components. But then what happens if we get button 5? It gets added to it. Well, we only still have 4 buttons. So now we have to go in and hand code this and say, okay, button 5 is the 4th piece of data. And then we can add that to our DOM. Okay, well, that was a little tedious. We had to like actually make sure we understood how many buttons there were on there, and then wrote, a function for each of those buttons, and then added each of those buttons to the DOM. Now what happens if I take all but one of those buttons away? Well, you're not going to see it. Well, we do. Okay, so we do have it. It's undefined in here, but a lot of times it'll break our code too, right? It's like, well, we only have 1 button, but why do we see these other 4 with nothing in it? Because it's passing undefined, right? So we get text content of undefined, but we still get those other buttons on the screen. So we need to understand that right now, in this aspect, our code is not dry, right? And we are not being flexible enough so that we can dynamically create components based on the data that we get. So I want you to think for a moment on how you would solve this problem. How would you make sure that every single item in your array had a corresponding component with it, no matter what, no matter if it was 1 or 100 or 1,000 items or 3 items or no items? How would you do that? Think for a second. So there's a couple of different ways we could do this. First, we can just create a for loop, right? I can create a simple for loop for let I equals 0, I less than fake data dot length, I plus plus, a basic for loop, and then come in here and do this, right? Let button equal button creator, and we could just pass the fake data I into there now. So what that's going to do is that's going to create a new button for us each time, right? Also remember from JavaScript that let is block scoped. So we can do this for each of the items and it still works even though we call it button for each of the items, right? So we got that piece over with, right? Now we're creating a new button for each item, right? We can even do this. Let's go console log, and we'll just say button. So we can see that we're getting 4 new separate buttons. There we go. We got 4 or 5, excuse me. There's 5 items on there. So 5 buttons, see, even now, right? And so now we get that for loop in there. One piece that's missing though is that we're still trying to add each individual button as an individually named button. And you'll see we get nothing on the screen because there's nothing called button 1. Even if I change that, that's block level scope, so it won't escape. We still get nothing on here. So what we need to do is we need to take this for loop down here, and instead of console logging it, we need to container.append child. And there we will now see that we've got all 5 of our buttons on there, right? And let's go add a 6th. Button 6. We've added a 6th. Totally fine, because we're going to iterate over each item on that array and create a component for it. Now let's say I only wanted that 1 button. Now we only have that 1 button there. And we don't have those other 5 blank buttons there any longer. So this is using a simple for loop to iterate over an array of data, create a new component based on that data, and then add that component to our DOM. Really cool stuff. So now we're really starting to get into like some powerful component creation stuff, right? Imagine if this was Facebook status updates, right? So your news feed and your component is your newsfeed card, right? And your Facebook, when you log into Facebook, it downloads a set of data and it takes that data and it creates a new component for each status, right? So that's a component, that's a reusable component. Same with like a tweet on Twitter, right? Each one of those is their own component. And it doesn't, none of that's hard coded in, right? That like Dan Frainer tweeted like JavaScript is awesome. That's not hard coded in. That's coming from the server, which is coming from a database, and that's dynamic data, and that can change at any moment. And so we need to create these applications. We're starting to get into some application mode here, where we are fluid enough in our data that we can create components based on the data that comes back to us. So that's using a straight regular for loop. We know that there's a couple of different array methods that work for for loops as well. And honestly, you're going to see these array methods used 99% of the time. You very rarely are going to see a for loop over some array data here. You'll see an array method. So let's take that and create an array method out of it. So we're going to use the array's built-in for loop method, which is called for each. Data, and we'll say for each. And remember, for each is going to take a callback. That callback is going to take at least the item. So this is going to call the callback for each item in this array. We'll just say item. And then we can just write the same exact code in there, right? But instead of having to say fake data, we'll just say item. We'll comment that out. And we'll see same thing has happened. Let's go ahead and uncomment those other buttons. And now we'll see that based on the data it received, it has rendered 6 buttons to the screen. All right, so that's essentially the same exact thing, but using for each. A really important one, especially when you get to React in the next unit or the next sprint, is going to be map. So let's go over map again. So fake data.map, and I'm going to comment this out as well. Now, for each is really good if we just want to iterate over the data and we want to add that to our DOM right away, right? It's fantastic, but it's instant, so it instantly adds the item to the DOM. Map, on the other hand, if you'll remember back, takes a very similar callback pattern to for each, but what map does is it is going to return a new array with the new items after being manipulated by the callback function. Okay, so this callback function should take this item, do something to it, and return something new. And then map is going to give us a new array, right? So if I say let button equal button creator, throw that item in there, and then I need to always return something in map. Otherwise, it's not going to do anything. I'm going to return that button, right? And then we can see that we have this new array of course. Open up the console itself. Let's try to get a little refresh on this. So log. Here are the buttons. So now we got, here are the buttons, and we'll see that we have these 6 buttons, and this is a DOM element inside of this array. So we have gone through, taken those strings, and we can even see if we go in here and go text content, boom, there it is. That string is in there now, but it's part of this new element. So now we have an array full of buttons. What we could do is we could hold this and wait for, maybe if someone clicks, show buttons, then it makes the buttons appear on the screen. We can actually go through and manipulate each of these buttons at a later time if we need to do that, maybe like make them a different color, etc. All this does is it gives us an array of these components to use as we wish. Now, this is a little bit more complicated, but it comes in handy a lot more than the for each method. Right now, you're just learning about creating components and putting them on the screen. But soon enough, you're going to be creating components, manipulating them further, doing something based on user interaction, etc. And it's good to have those components in an array. But for now, let's just take that buttons array, do a little for each, and then we'll say container dot append child button, and we'll get our buttons to appear on the screen, right? And let's go mess with our data. And just a reminder, why we do this is because you don't always have this cool array here. This might be completely unknown to you and might never be known to you. You just know that you get an array from another place, maybe a server or another file, and you're just plugging that array in, right? So you will rarely get to see each of the items on the array like we can see it now. This is a great learning exercise because we can see, look, let's go in here and just maybe the server comes back with 4 buttons, right? And now we're going to render it based on what's in the array. Now you can start to see how powerful components can be and how we can start to create the building blocks of a web application much more in depth than just a simple web page. We are going to be getting data, rendering components based on that data, based on user interaction, et cetera, and it's really, really cool stuff. Tomorrow we're going to learn about how to get data from a server, but for right now, let's learn about creating components, component creators, functions that create components, and then iterating over arrays of data to create components dynamically. That's it for this lecture. Have fun with this. It's really cool stuff, and I'll see you in the next lesson.